my god, it is so weird to talk to yourself to a camera in the dark for an hour. What is teaching in the 21st century? This week, we are going over a very important, very centralized in terms of power, empire in the region of what is modern-day Iran. This week, we are going over, in this lecture, the Persians and their neighbors, very decentralized, but no less culturally significant, the Greeks. To understand this history, we have to first, however, talk about the beginning of history as a profession. We need to start our story with someone who, for a long time, was called the father of modern history, a Greek man living under Persian control in Halicarnassus named Herodotus, and his major text is the Histories, or if you prefer, sound fancy, the Historia. The Historia begins. These are the researches of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, which he publishes in the hope of thereby preserving from decay the remembrance of what men have done, and of preventing the great and wonderful actions of the Greeks and the barbarians from losing their due meed of glory, and withal to put on record what were their grounds of feuds. According to the Persians best informed in history, the Phoenicians began the quarrel. This people, who had formerly dwelt on the shores of the Erythraean Sea, having migrated to the Mediterranean and settled in parts which they now inhabit, began at once, they say, to adventure on long voyages, freighting their vessels with the wares of Egypt and Assyria. Herodotus continues, they landed at many places on the coast, and among the rest at Argos, which was then preeminent above all the states included now under the common name of Hellas. That's going to be Greece. Here they exposed their merchandise and traded with the natives for 5 or 6 days, at the end of which time, when almost everything was sold, there came down to the beach a number of women, and among them the daughter of the king, who was, they say, agreeing in this with the Greeks, Io, the child of Inachus. The women were standing by the stern of the ship, intent upon their purchases, when the Phoenicians, with a general shout, rushed upon them. The greater part made their escape, but some were seized and carried off. Io herself was among the captives. The Phoenicians put the women on board their vessels and set sail for Egypt. Thus did Io pass into Egypt, according to the Persian story, which differs widely from the Phoenician, and thus commenced, according to their authors, the series of outrages. Essentially, what follows in these series of outrages leading to the Peloponnesian Wars is a bunch of Mediterranean people, be they Greek, be they Persian, be they Phoenician, running around the Mediterranean, abducting women and taking them home, until Alexander of Priam steals a woman from a Greek territory by the name of Helen. This really angers the Greeks, who send in an army, and Herodotus tells us the following. Hitherto, the injuries on either side had been mere acts of common violence, but in what followed, the Persians considered that the Greeks were greatly to blame, since before any attack had been made on Europe, they led an army into Asia. Now, as for the carrying off of women, it is the deed, they say, of a rogue, but to make a stir about such as are carried off argues a man a fool. Men of sense care nothing for such women, since it is plain that without their own consent they would never be forced away. The Asiatics, when the Greeks ran off with their women, never troubled themselves about the matter, but the Greeks, for the sake of a single Lacedaemonian girl, collected a vast armament, invaded Asia, and destroyed the kingdom of Priam. Henceforth, they ever looked upon the Greeks as their open enemies, for Asia, with all the various tribes of barbarians that inhabit it, is regarded by the Persians as their own. But Europe and the Greek race they look on as distinct and separate. Such is the account which the Persians give of these matters. They trace to the attack upon Troy their ancient enmity toward the Greeks. The Phoenicians, however, as regards Io, vary from the Persian statements. They deny they used any violence to remove her into Egypt. She herself, they say, having formed an intimacy with the captain while his vessel lay at Argos, and perceiving herself to be with child, of her own free will accompanied the Phoenicians on their leaving the shore to escape the shame of detection and reproach from her parents. Whether this latter account be true, or whether the matter happened otherwise, I shall not discuss further. I shall proceed at once to point out the person who first, within my own knowledge, inflicted injury on the Greeks, after which I shall go forward with my history, describing equally the greater and the lesser cities. For the cities which were formerly great have most of them become insignificant, and such as are at present powerful were weak in the olden time. I shall therefore discourse equally of both, convinced that human happiness never continues long in one stay. Herodotus, in understanding this history, is incredibly important. He's not just important for understanding relations between the Persians and the Greeks, he's important for understanding a whole host of historical issues within the Persian Empire. It is possible, but not definite, that he traveled to Egypt during his lifetime. Whether it's definite or not, he is our first source of how mummification is actually done in the human historical record. Of course, not the first source of mummification at all. There is, however, something we might pause with Herodotus here just to say very quickly, and that is that for a long time within the Western tradition, Herodotus has been considered the father of history as a profession. History is something one does, history, as a mode of writing. And I think in this corner of the world that might be a fair claim. Herodotus does a lot of things. Although he calls the Persians barbarians, he's also very intent on demonstrating their military glories. He's very intent on describing the greatness and grandeur of their cities, their works, as much as anyone else. So in that example there, he's a very fair writer. He also appreciates change over time. Great cities come, great cities go, they rise, they fall. You'll notice that in the excerpts we read here, which are just the first few pages of his Historia, we open with no reference to gods. We open with no reference to the supernatural. This is all, sort of basic human world political stuff. All that's great. But I would say, just if we want to think of him as the father of history writing as a profession at all, that claim, to me at least, seems a little dubious and a little focused on the West. I mean, Herodotus is born in 484 BCE, where he produces this Historia, the significance of which I do not deny, of course, my God, for understanding this time and place. But Confucius, for example, is born 551 BCE, and did he or did he not have a heavy hand in editing the Spring and Autumn Annals, a history of the state of Lu, where he is from. So, history writing predates Herodotus, despite the fact that there are certain elements of what he's doing that looks similar to the way a history might be written now. Of course, we don't go around calling anybody barbarians anymore, but there you have it. Okay, so with that, here is the man himself, Herodotus, roughly 485-484 to 425 BCE. Where's he from? He's from what is now southwest Turkey, in a city, as you saw on the slide from his own text, called Halicarnassus, now Bodrum. This place is a large Greek-speaking community where he's from, and he would have been, despite living in a Greek-speaking community, a subject of the Persian Empire, ruled by a dynasty called the Achaemenids. This Achaemenid dynasty would have ruled over a region that's incredibly diverse, spans over parts of Eurasia, the Eastern Mediterranean, and parts, as since we're mentioning Egypt, of course, parts of Africa. And again, that diversity is something that is so key to how empires work. And we let this theme fall a bit in this series of lectures, but we need to bring it back for now. An empire is different than a modern-day nation-state. To live in a nation-state, one can reasonably expect that everyone basically follows the same core set of laws. Everyone basically speaks the same language. Everyone more or less has a similar culture. This is, less true in our modern world than it was in, the beginning of the previous century, but it still holds. Empires don't work like this. Empires are all about accumulation of surplus production through tax, and as long as that accumulation is flowing and that accumulation is stable, there's an enormous amount of diversity that is allowed. Now, let's not be romantic. Nobody wants to go back and live during the Persian Empire or any other one. It was hot. There wasn't the internet. It sucked. But local places could have their own laws. Local people could generally speak their own local languages without having to, carefully study and be fluent in the language of their government at the center of the empire. Thus, Halicarnassus is a Greek place, thoroughly, culturally, linguistically, all of it, and yet part of the Persian Empire. As long as the tax flows, and as long as that system is stable, and we'll talk about that system shortly, as long as there's homogeneity there can be an enormous amount of heterogeneity going on within the territories of the emperor below it. In any case, back to Herodotus. He writes this Historia, the Histories, which again is a history of his Persian rulers and many of their subjects. This again is how we know things about Egypt, for example. Historia itself, or history, means inquiry or investigation. And although Herodotus, as you've already seen, calls the Persians barbarians, he does, as I mentioned, go through great pains to kind of treat their, what he calls great and marvelous deeds, with as steady and an even of a hand as you're going to get in this time period. If we can stick with the Historia just a little longer, this is a text that presents the history, folklore, geography, the plants, and the customs of people throughout what would have been Herodotus's known world during his lifetime. He visited Greece. He may have visited Egypt. He went through the Crimean Peninsula. He went through Sicily, Babylon, and possibly North Africa. He finishes his book, this Historia, in 431 BCE before dying in the town of Turi in Italy, and he definitely makes it to Italy. Much of the Histories is devoted to explaining the power of, again, the Persians, who ruled under, as I've said, the Achaemenid dynasty from North Africa to the Indus River Valley. So from North Africa, Egypt, etc., all the way over into what becomes Pakistan. It is a massive empire. They ruled from the Arabian Sea to Samarkand in Central Asia. They would have had at their height a total population, not insignificant, of 30 to 35 million people. The numbers are getting big. The Greeks are notable in this history and are alongside this empire because they are one of the few groups who are able to fight the Persians off. In Athens, instead of living under Persian imperial control, the Greeks develop a new political system called democracy. This democracy, however, let's not get too romantic about it either. We don't want to go back and live in an empire, or at least I don't. And, we probably, unless you are a land-owning, upper-crust Greek man, you don't want to go back and live in Greek democracy either. We're talking about, say in Athens, a political unit, a city-state of about 300,000 people. And to whom do they extend these rights of democracy and decision-making? Well, they don't extend them to slaves, and they do not extend them to women. And in fact, only about 30,000 men out of this 300,000 total population would have taken a direct hand in political decision-making. Now, on the other side of this, we have the Achaemenids and their very flexible system of government, which allowed them to rule many different groups of people for almost 200 years until they're finally defeated by the Macedonian king Alexander the Great. Alexander's empire, however, once he takes hold, really he struggles to adopt and live in their system. His answer to how to switch from conqueror to ruler is to simply adopt the Achaemenid framework. He does so to some success, but as soon as he is dead, that project falls apart. We have our main powers, our main sort of geographic spaces for the lecture for this time period. Let's start talking about their early days and where they come from. And let's start with the Achaemenids. To understand where the Achaemenids come from, we have to go back to those Indo-Europeans, a folk we haven't talked about since we were talking about ancient India and the rise of Buddhism. Around about 1000 BCE, these Indo-Europeans arrive as nomads, as they did elsewhere, in Iran. And what they find when they get to Iran is a place where water flows from streams in tall mountains down into high plateaus, ending eventually in salt lakes or deserts. Farming in this region is only possible through digging irrigation channels. The first people to do this lived in a place called Persis. So the first nomads to come in and develop irrigation and build a settled agricultural society live in Persis in what is now southwestern Iran. And from Persis, of course, my God, we get the name Persia. Beginning sometime around 550 BCE, the Achaemenids created the world's largest empire to date. Well, to date in the narrative we are doing, so far in this world history. The first one in their time. It contained the world's most advanced cities and most barren regions, aka deserts. A key to the enormous territory was the use of what are called satraps. Now, the use of this satrap system started with the third ruler of the Persian Empire, Darius. After the Persians conquered a new area, they would appoint local governors, aka satraps, who oversaw tax collection. There is the answer. So the way the Persians rule is they go around conquering territory and leaving in place, as often as they can, local elites. Do you want to die, local elite who has been defeated by our army recently? Or do you want to continue living in a place of relative power? You're no longer absolute ruler, but you are welcome to be governor for us if you continue generally keeping the peace, generally overseeing how you had been overseeing, but collecting taxes for us, giving us that surplus that keeps an empire running. Most people take the satrap option. I'll stay alive and collect your taxes. Thanks. Before we get too far into the Persian Empire and how it operated at a sort of structural level, let's pause and go over the sort of belief systems of these early Iranian peoples. The best source for understanding these early peoples of Persia is very much like the best source for understanding early Mesopotamia, early Egypt, early Hebrew culture, and so on and so forth. It is, of course, a religious text, and this time we get the Avesta. This is a text that is formed as an oral tradition sometime around 1000 BCE and is written down, codified, quite a many centuries later in 600 CE. The Avesta here means the injunction of Zarathustra, and Zarathustra, I'm going to mess that word up every time, is our key prophet. This is the core text of a religion called Zoroastrianism, the oldest religion on earth still being practiced. Our prophet, Zarathustra, would have lived in what is now modern-day Afghanistan. He is our main prophet, and he tells us the story of a supreme deity named Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Truth. This Ahura Mazda, in the beginning of all things, gave birth to two cosmic deities, a good spirit and an evil spirit. And these spirits, the good and the evil, do not sit well together. Instead, they are in a constant struggle throughout history. Good always getting the edge here, evil always getting the edge there. So what this does is this bakes into Zoroastrianism a core dualism. There will always be good, there will always be evil, so long as history, the human world, is still unfolding. But the human world, history, won't unfold forever. A judgment day is coming. We will all, one day, stand before Ahura Mazda, and then we will have to account for how we have behaved in our lives. Because we will be judged, we need to prepare. People get to decide, according to Zoroastrian beliefs, whether they stand on the side of good or the side of evil, and they demonstrate that decision through their actions. Doing evil allows the sort of evil spirit side of this struggle more victories and allows them to not to be too simple about it, but they score more points when you're evil. Good scores more points when you are good. So good actions have a direct impact. Your good actions in your life have a direct impact in your final outcome in Judgment Day and the final decision in this world. Did good win or did evil win? Most ritual practices within this belief system surrounded the maintenance of altars of fire, watched over by a hereditary male priest class called magi. So when I say hereditary, I mean if you are a male magi, your son becomes a magi, and so on. So this is a role that people pass down through their families. Rituals involved reciting 2 core prayers, stressing the importance of always speaking the truth and always searching for the truth, something over which you as an individual in your lifetime have power, but something that also has ultimately cosmic results. So this is a very interesting belief system. As we've seen a bit with Buddhism, the individual gets power over their final destiny. We see a little, not so much in Confucianism or Taoism do you have any direct control. But once we get to Zoroastrianism, we get this idea return. You don't necessarily need, how to put it, you have some say. The individual matters. You don't just need a ritualist to set the natural world in harmony so you can farm and have a safe pregnancy and things like that. You, the individual, no matter who you are, you have something to contribute to sort of battle between good and evil. So it really personalizes spiritual beliefs. Burial rituals here become extremely unique in this sort of early Persia Zoroastrian tradition. Zoroastrians believe that dead bodies polluted the ground, and my God, can't they be forgiven for thinking that? Because they do. You don't want to just be throwing all your dead bodies into or next to a river, for example. So Zoroastrians, as part of their burial practice, left corpses out for scavenging birds to pick apart. Once your body had been cleaned of all the meat, your bones had been dried in the sun, then those bones themselves would be cleaned and would be buried, and you would be able to rest until the day when we all, of course, meet Ahura Mazda and are called to account. Back to the political and military stuff. About 612 BCE, an Iranian tribe called the Medes, I'm guessing again, Medes, defeated the Assyrians, a people we haven't talked about since we were talking about the Hebrew peoples. After this defeat, or after this victory rather, they begin expanding beyond Iran into Western Asia. By 550 BCE, a leader by the name of Cyrus, who is from our original location, Persis, defeats then the Medes and founds in their pre-existing territory the Achaemenid dynasty. So Cyrus is the founder of this all-important first Persian dynasty. As Cyrus's army spread, it grew from a self-supported force paid with the spoils of war. So the more you defeat, the more you conquer, the more you get paid. That's the sort of incentive structure. To full-time professional soldiers. I will pay you a wage based off of the revenue I have through, you guessed it, tax collection, the extraction of agricultural surplus in a sustained and stable fashion. This is the only way one can have professional soldiers. If you are conquering and you are on the up, those soldiers are amateurs. They are winning through the spoils of war. They're basically on a commission system, but not once the Achaemenid dynasty is founded. Let's return quickly to our earlier assertion in previous lectures that pre-modern states are all essentially protection rackets. You pay me, I will protect you from outside invaders, I will offer a police system, I will offer you infrastructure, irrigation, roads, protected markets, that kind of thing. If you don't pay me, we're coming for you. So this is how everything is sort of working. This, of course, also includes, as we see everywhere, religious protections. One must keep the gods happy and nature in harmony. So rulers always have a ceremonial, a supernatural element to their protection racket they are running. And that's not to be cynical. That's not to say that people didn't believe in these supernatural things, but it is 100% part of the protection racket nonetheless. When the Persians set up their protection racket, their state, they begin by building an enormous road system. Some of these roads were dirt, some near cities would have been paved. Government couriers used these roads regularly, and here communication becomes incredibly quick and incredibly important. Couriers along the Persian road systems could travel as far as 90 miles per day, allowing for what was at the time some of the most rapid communication across great distances available on Earth. And what would they have been communicating? They would have been communicating between various branches, various segments, portions of the military. Roads are a double-edged sword for the subjects of an empire. They allow you, the subject, to get your grain to the place where you pay your tax. That's good for you, so you don't get punished. They allow you on the way to sell surplus grain, make a profit for yourself. They allow for all kinds of transport. But they also allow for the state to communicate with its military forces quite quickly, and if there is a portion of the empire that's getting a little bit out of pocket, they allow the military to get there very, very quickly. So roads a double-edged sword. Our ruler Cyrus, his empire continues to expand north and west into Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, and a wealthy region called Lydia. About 600 BCE, so this is before Cyrus, the first metal coins in world history were actually produced in Lydia, which, flashing forward to our period where the Achaemenids exist, Cyrus now controls. As Cyrus moved through Syria, Palestine, and Babylon, he left local cultures intact. I'm not interested in changing your religion. I'm not interested in making you speak one language or another. I'm not interested in changing very much, but some, about your laws. What I want is your tax. So Cyrus goes along and he's making offerings to local gods. I don't care what god it is. It's your god. That's good enough. Here's an offering. He's allowing people to worship how they wished. He just wants that tax. He's just setting up a system for extracting the surplus. He even, and this is significant to earlier modules, it is Cyrus himself who frees the Hebrews from their Babylonian captivity, that moment when they had to rethink their own history, and the end result was the Hebrew Bible, or if you prefer, the Old Testament. Cyrus, however, was not invincible. In 530 BCE, he loses a battle against the Massagetae, in which he is killed. He's not buried in Zoroastrian fashion, however. Instead, he is buried with finery in a building that looks much like a ziggurat, one you can see in the slide on your screen. There's possible evidence then, him not being buried that way, him not being buried appropriately, Cyrus not being left out for his bones to be picked, that the Achaemenids as rulers, as an elite class, may not have been completely Zoroastrian, despite the fact that many of their subjects were. I would be remiss here if I didn't point out something that I think is very interesting. We have Cyrus, King Cyrus, not, you will agree, hopefully, a man of the Hebrew God, and therefore, although Christianity does not yet exist in this history, not a man of the Christian God, nor a law, right? Here we're talking about the Hebrews. Not a man of Hebrew God, and yet doing something that helps the Hebrews. I would be remiss if I didn't point out the ongoing significance of these events in world history to recent political events, at least in the United States, and our interpretation of them. What I mean by this is a recent interpretation, and this is no secret, this is no conspiracy. Benjamin Netanyahu himself publicly made this comparison, and if you Google it yourself, there's no end of the sort of essays you can read comparing the former President Donald Trump to King Cyrus, this comparison being made by mostly evangelical Christians of the conservative, of course, persuasion in the United States. If we read from the book of Ezra, in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, as you prefer, chapter 6, verses 3 through 5 read, "In the first year of King Cyrus, Cyrus the king issued a decree. Concerning the house of God at Jerusalem, let the temple, the place where sacrifices are offered, be rebuilt, and let its foundation be retained, its height being 60 cubits, and its width 60 cubits. with 3 layers of huge stones and 1 layer of timbers, and let the cost be paid from the royal treasury. Also let the gold and silver utensils of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar, I hope you remember him, took from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon. This is the Babylonian captivity, the exile. This is exactly what we talked about in Module 2 when we talked about the Hebrew peoples. Let all that be returned and brought to their places in the temple in Jerusalem, and you shall put them in the house of God. Why am I stopping here? Well, I find it incredibly interesting that, as I said, this story of King Cyrus, who is obviously not, I hope you agree, a man of the Hebrew God, in this story, at least according to its logic, is nonetheless doing the work of the Hebrews' God. He is freeing them from the Babylonian captivity. He is, as you can see in their own account in the Old Testament, rebuilding their temple at Jerusalem. This man who is not of God is nonetheless doing God's work. This logic was recently employed in U.S. political thinking to sort of explain for people of a conservative persuasion on the evangelical right, how should we think about President Trump? It's very clear that he is not a man of God. He holds Bibles in strange ways for photo presentations, and he has lots of divorces, and there's Stormy Daniels and all the old controversies of the Trump era, right? There's a lot of people who support this, so this is, although I might have my own criticisms, this is not meant as a criticism, just meant as a point of history finding new life in our current context. There were a lot of supporters of Donald Trump who said, do you know who he is? He's our Cyrus. Look what he's done, for example, with the Supreme Court. Is he evangelical Christian? No. Is what he's doing in our favor? Yes. So is Trump a man of God? No. Does he do God's work according to these folk? Yes. So I think that's super interesting to see all this come back to life so recently in our world of political ideology. I think that is an interesting aside, but as the young folk, or maybe middle-aged folk pretending to be young folk like to say, please do not at me re recent U.S. politics. It's not my fault that debate exists in those terms, and it's always interesting to see characters in history get new life. Let's press forward in our history of the Persian Empire. Cyrus is dead. Long live Cyrus. Who rules in his stead? His son Cambyses rules until 522 BCE. Once Cambyses dies, a priest in his court, Gaumata, covers up for a very brief period his death and tries to rule in his place. This works for less than a year, because that same year, 522 BCE, a gentleman named Darius I leads a group of rebels, 6 conspirators, who succeed in killing Gaumata. And according at least to Herodotus, with whom we opened our lectures, the conspirators begin a debate. Should our new system of government, now that we are in power, be a democracy, an oligarchy ruled by a few, or a monarchy ruled by one? And it is Darius who wins the debate for the side of monarchy. Darius makes the case that democracies, oligarchies are inefficient ways of governing because who decides when no one can decide? Who decides when an intractable problem comes up? Who's the person at the helm? There must be a monarch. And while they cannot agree who the monarch should be, they agree that there should be a monarch. They leave who should be the monarch, according to Herodotus, to chance. They say, let's all go to bed. The person whose horse neighs first at sunrise, that person will be selected to be the monarch. So Darius hires a hand, or uses one of his already hired hands to make sure that it is in fact his horse that makes the first noise at sunup, and therefore, just politely following the agreement, these people who already killed a man to take power, just hand power over to Darius I and make him king of kings, the title he takes. Some of that story probably doesn't hold up. Herodotus's job as an early historian was to tell stories not for academic import, but as entertainment to broad audiences who paid to see them. So, you get a little gossipy inflation to these kind of things. Nonetheless, Darius I, major proponent of monarchy, he becomes king. Now in power, 522 BCE, Darius commemorates his ascension to the throne with an inscription at a place called Behistun. And his inscription read, "There was not a man, neither a Persian nor a Mede, nor anyone of our family, who could have taken the kingdom from Gaumata the Magian. The people feared him greatly. Then I prayed to, hey, guess who that is? Ahura Mazda, the god of the Zoroastrians. Ahura Mazda bore me aid. Then I, with a few men, slew Gaumata. Ahura Mazda bestowed the kingdom upon me." Isn't that a delight? We've got a king coming in, establishing his rule over a pre-existing system, and guess what? It turns out that the god of this system, the god of the people, remember Cyrus, it's unclear how Zoroastrian he was, but our friend here, Darius I, immediately, it is through Ahura Mazda that he takes power. When Cyrus takes power, the empire over which he rules is genuinely enormous. How does he rule it? He keeps in place some of what Cyrus was doing, and in some parts he makes reform. It's a flexible administrative system and tax system that exists alongside a fairly uniform law code for everyone. So how it's administered in the tax system, that has some wiggle, but there are elements of the law code that now everyone must answer to. Judges in this system are appointed for life, and they were seen not just as legal figures or political figures, but bear in mind the Zoroastrian tradition here. These judges, deciding who was right or who was wrong in a certain case, are doing the work of Ahura Mazda on earth, determining the ultimate balance between good and evil. Now, funnily enough, Herodotus, who has a lot to say about this tax system, is not a big fan. So again, everything, you'll get so tired of hearing me say it, everything is about extracting surplus in a stable, sustainable way. Everything is about tax. Tax is the name of the game, and of that tax, Herodotus tells us in his Historia, during the reign of Cyrus and Cambyses, there was no fixed tribute at all. The revenue coming from gifts only. That is probably not true. And because of his imposition of regular taxes and other similar measures, the Persians called Darius the huckster, Cambyses a master, and Cyrus a father. The first being out for profit wherever he could get it, the second harsh and arrogant, and the third merciful and ever working for their well-being. That's a little too much. Herodotus is overdoing it a bit here again. So these histories always have to be corrected with other sources. Cyrus, of course, had a regular tax system. He had his satraps. Cambyses also had a regular tax system, but Darius does reform this system. He makes it more, he's extracting more resource, although what that resource is exactly is flexible. We can talk about what Darius's satrapies, what his tax system was actually like. So he makes his satraps just like Cyrus, just like Cambyses would have used, recruiting locally important people, local officials and things like that, and bringing them into his system. They would have submitted a fixed amount of revenue each year. We have to have our surplus, we have to have our tax. Most of this would not have been, by this point, grain. Most of this would have instead been silver, but not all the time. There are cases, for example, in Egypt, the provinces in Egypt, they paid their tax in 120,000 bushels of grain annually. The Ethiopians, on the other hand, would have paid their annual tax in 2 quarts of unrefined gold and 200 logs of ebony and 20 elephant tusks. So, ivory, not everyone is paying in the same denomination. Darius, great and important though he is in stabilizing the Persian Empire, is also not immortal. Darius I dies in 486 BCE and is succeeded by Xerxes. In 465 BCE, Xerxes' younger son, kills his father and older brother to take power over the throne. Power of the administrative structures allowed the Persians to keep power until 331 BCE, and that is a major statement of the strength of the administrative structures, the bureaucracy of the Persian Empire. You can have people at the top just killing each other over and over again, but as long as the government itself operates on stable principles, it can survive that kind of turmoil, and indeed the Persian Empire does for another century after Xerxes' assassination. Let's switch gears and talk about the Greeks. So the Greek peninsula was, like Iran, populated by Indo-Europeans. This time, Indo-Europeans are making it into the region about 2000 BCE. Both the Greeks and the Phoenicians, who were both mentioned by Herodotus earlier, were active merchants in the Mediterranean area. Neither one of them, however, ever developed a centralized government to rule over these dispersed and diverse populations. Neither the Greeks nor the Phoenicians then ever developed an empire. Instead, what they had was a network of culturally connected but politically independent city-states. This is a bit strange to think about in history if you've never thought about the history of Greece. It means there's never one political entity, never one, for lack of a better word, nation, that you could point at in the ancient world and say, there, that is Greece. People were culturally Hellenistic. Remember, Greece is Hellas. But they would have been citizens of whatever relevant city-state. By 500 BCE, Athens becomes the largest city-state in this world. And this is a world of many city-states. It's the largest out of over 100. Democracy, famously associated with Greek traditions, is a product of Athens and Athens alone, and as I mentioned earlier, it is to the benefit of free men in Athens and free men in Athens alone. So we're talking about a democracy that really describes the ability of about 10% of the Athenian population to take part in political decision-making. And in a correction to the sort of historical imagination damage done to some of you by hack comic author, Batman comics aside that he did, Frank Miller, and even worse director, Zack Snyder. If it weren't for whom, I'd still be able to watch Batman movies. I had to, I've never seen BVS. That's a dead letter to me, and I never will. And now we can never watch another Batman movie again. So bad is Zack Snyder's directorial vision. Nonetheless, what I'm coming to is when you think about this period, the phrase, this is Sparta, and Sparta as sort of the great military power in ancient Greece comes to mind, but that's not true. Athens was not just the cultural hegemon of ancient Greece. It was also indisputably the military power. Our Indo-Europeans who are first arriving in Greece would have found rocky coasts that did not sustain the herds of mostly horses that they were using to survive. Nor are there any major rivers with any regular flooding, like in Egypt, that could have sustained agriculture. So here, as in Persia, the name of the game is irrigated farming. This is the key to civilizational development. What are they growing? They're growing barley in the lowlands, they're growing olive trees in the foothills, and they're growing grapes on the hillsides. These are the major crops. There is in this world plentiful evidence of interconnected trade, as already suggested by Herodotus in his Historia. Between 2000 and 1500 BCE, on Crete, there existed lavish palaces, roads, bronze work, and an undeciphered writing system called Linear A. The people living in these lavish palaces, walking on these roads, using this bronze work, and writing in Linear A, have been named by archaeologists Minoans after King Minos, but we really don't know who they were because we can't read what they wrote. Minoan civilization ended in about 1500 BCE, probably because they were conquered by the subsequent group to live in the region, the Mycenaeans. And the Mycenaeans use a script called Linear B, which we do know quite a lot about because deciphered in 1952 when it was found out that it was simply a dialect of Greek. This is also the period, these very early days, when we get from Homer both the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the textbook that is used in reference to this class makes the very intriguing observation or assertion that Homer, the author of these great two texts, might himself not have been a person, but perhaps, at least according to some, the name of an oral tradition, which I think is very interesting. In either case, the Iliad and the Odyssey describe the Trojan Wars from centuries before the Iliad and the Odyssey would have been composed, and it's unsure if these really happened or not. The Iliad and the Odyssey are the main source. There's scant other evidence. In either case, by 1200 BCE, the Mycenaeans themselves fall apart and disappear out of the record, and we know this because with them also disappears their language, Linear B. We got the Greeks, but we also have the Phoenicians. So while these Greek civilizations, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, as these are rising and falling, the Phoenicians begin their own societies in the Western Mediterranean. Their name, the Phoenicians, comes from the Greek for red men, probably related to a dye that they produced from snail glands and would have used a lot in the goods that they made and that they traded, and trade is the name of the game if you're Phoenician. After about 900 BCE, the Phoenicians moved out of their homeland somewhere in Lebanon and brought with them an alphabet of about 22 consonants. And this is not just any alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet, listen friends, is the first alphabet. We've had weird writing systems, some pictorial, some phonetic. It's the Phoenicians who give us our first alphabet proper. By 814 BCE, the Phoenicians had an outpost at a place called Carthage in modern-day Tunisia. This is going to be extremely important, this Phoenician outpost, when we get to Rome. Please keep it in your mind. They continued along northern Africa into southern Spain, slowly growing their own little civilization, these masters of sailing on the Mediterranean. New colonies were founded by sending men and women to new places along the Mediterranean to found little towns. Sometimes they would have been sent in groups as large as 30,000 at one time. There is also a claim that the Phoenicians might have circumnavigated Africa. Again, the Phoenicians are excellent at sea travel, but this claim to circumnavigate Africa has never been fully demonstrated. They definitely, however, transmitted naval knowledge and their alphabet to the Greeks. They would control western and southern Mediterranean until they're defeated by Rome in 202 BCE. It's an interesting pattern of movement. These sometimes 30,000 men and women who are moving, these Phoenician men and women, one little city at a time. They're not sailing around and raiding, but they're moving by finding a new place, finding suitable land, and you stay there for a season. You plant your crops, you wait, you harvest your crops, and then you use the benefit of that harvest to fund yet a further expedition of some of the people among you to yet another town. So you establish a town, establish farming. With that farming, send some people further. Establish a town, establish farming. With that farming, send some people further, and so on. And that's how they move around North Africa and into Spain. Let's talk a bit more about the establishment of these Greek city-states. There's no historical evidence, no historical materials from ancient Greece between the fall of the Mycenaeans and their Linear B in 1200 BCE to 900 BCE. We have no idea, really, clearly, what happened over the course of these 300 years. There's a new era, however, that begins about 800 BCE, where various regions start to form these aforementioned city-states. We get more intensive farming, leading to better agricultural production, and you should know by now what that means. You get population explosion, you get diversity, and clear divisions of labor and things like that. In this society, most people would have farmed. A tiny minority of these people lived inside cities with markets for these goods that were farmed and temples to various gods. You know the gods we're working up to. Each city-state was small. Would have had between 5,000 and 10,000 people. Of course, Athens becomes massive. But these city-states were nonetheless self-sufficient. They had their own laws, they had their own courts, and each of them had their own distinct and independent military. Each would have had a guardian deity with a temple inside the city walls. They would have had a pantheon of gods headed by Zeus and Hera, and these would have been generally shared, but the guardian deities, you get your own. Athena, for example, is, and I hope you could have guessed this, the guardian deity of Athens, a goddess of wisdom, war, and weaving. The Greeks communicated with the gods through animal sacrifices and oracles. The oracle at Delphi is probably the most famous among these. People came to the oracle at Delphi, among others, to ask priests what people ask priests everywhere in the world. What's going to happen in the future? When should I plant? Will I die if I get pregnant? When will I die if I can't get pregnant? These kinds of things. People traveled from temple to temple praying for medical help or participating in the Olympic Games, which were held every 4 years beginning in 776 BCE at the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. In all, the Greeks established over 250 city-states in the Mediterranean and Black Sea areas, connected many times to mother city-states through trade. So I said earlier all city-states are completely independent. That's not totally true. Major city-states like Athens were able to establish little colonial endeavors elsewhere, and that colonial endeavor would remain connected to Athens. All city-states, no matter who they answer to, are connected through trade, but for the most part, we're still in a politically decentralized world. Most of these city-states are nonetheless politically independent. This period while the Greeks are moving out into the world after 800 BCE, we get the Greeks adopting that Phoenician alphabet, and they make a major addition to that Phoenician alphabet: vowels. Yes, that's right, friends, the Phoenician alphabet, only consonants. Our first full inscription in Greek with this addition of vowels comes to us in 730 BCE. After about 200 years of this ancient Greek development, and about 600 BCE, Greek city-states, although still independent, each find themselves in roughly a similar situation. They are, all of them, ruled in their own independence by a few wealthy landowners. Reforms eventually, however, begin, especially, for example, with Sparta, which starts really parsing its citizens and settling out who can do what and who cannot do what. Sparta begins by granting extensive rights to its citizens, but who its citizens are is fairly limited. Spartan citizens are soldiers. If you want to be a Spartan citizen, you have to be descended from the original group of Spartans, and you had to be a full-time soldier. You're not allowed to engage in farming as a profession. You're not allowed to engage in trade as a profession. That's segment one. Now, beneath these Spartans, you have what the Spartans called dwellers around. These are people that lived within Spartan territory, but were conquered by the Spartans, not originally born into them. And dwellers around could own land, and they could act as craftspeople, as traders, but they did not have that all-important voting capacity that Spartan citizen soldiers had. Now, below the the dwellers around, you had the helots. The helots are going to be our lowest ranking folk. These are full-time slaves who farmed land for our citizens. And that should, although it's not great by our standards, it does make some sense. Spartans cannot farm. They are soldiers. Who farms their land? Who makes their food? Helots, the slave class. Estates were mostly ran by women because Spartan men often were away at war. So women in Spartan society are incredibly important in the sort of economic and managerial realm because they are the ones overseeing these large plantation-scale farms while their husbands are off in the military. Spartan citizens joined this military very young, and they could expect a quite austere upbringing. You were a citizen only after you completed your military training, and citizens had limited veto power over policies enacted by council elders who ruled alongside two kings in what is an oligarchical system. So we have our two kings, we have a council of elders, and then we have our soldier citizens who have a sort of limited veto power over the decisions of that council of elders. It took another century for Athens to develop democracy. Its most famous reformer, Solon was a civilian head of Athens in 594 BCE, and Solon abolished an abhorrent tax in Athens, which was 1/6 of all crops had to go to the state, and also launched debt cancellation programs, allowing debtors to then purchase land. So you get out of your debt, you're allowed to purchase land, you get some tax relief, you can establish yourself as a sort of self-sustaining farmer, and the hope was upon that foundation, one could build a more sustainable and just economy. Staying in Athens by 508 BCE, a group of aristocrats established direct democracy. All citizens above the age of 20, who were men, could join the lawmaking assembly. And this has some pros and this has some cons. What were the sort of political beliefs of these early proponents of direct democracy, limited though it was in Athens? Well, they were fierce supporters of personal and political liberty. You should be able to do what you want with your body in your free time, in your life. You should be able to say what you want politically. So that means they also believed, of course, in freedom of speech, and for men above the age of 20, political equality, one person, one vote, that sort of idea. These ideas lasted until Athenian democracy itself collapsed in 322 BCE. The best position for women in this society in Athens was to be married to a citizen, married to one of these men above the age of 20. Children in this society were only seen as legitimate if they were born within the context of marriage. But Athenian men had many sexual partners, both men and women. They would sleep with sex workers, they would have concubines that they had to support out of their own funds, and of course they could force themselves on enslaved men and women that they owned. But the children of any of these unions, the children had with a sex worker, a concubine, or a slave, these were not legitimate citizens. These people were not open to becoming citizens. You had to be married for that child to be legitimate, to be a citizen, and thus we sort of understand how, well, okay, men over the age of 20 can join, the lawmaking assembly, and yet only 10% of Athens' population was part of it. It's because there's a lot of illegitimate kids. Well, partly because there's a lot of illegitimate kids running around Athens. No, you say, you are incredulous. Friend, listen. Athens' population, the point we're speaking now, was 300,000 people total. Its slave population was 120,000 people. That's 40% of the Athenian population were enslaved people. So yes, I'm being very serious when I'm explaining how it is that only 10% of the population were those men over the age of 20 who were citizens who could engage in direct democracy. Slaves were of different types. Some were highly skilled, some were low skilled. The lower skilled ones work in the fields, higher skilled ones work inside in different kinds of industry, but no matter what it is, you have no political rights. So while there's lots of great ideas and things that we can favorably reflect on in Athenian and Greek history generally, there's some massive qualifications to how much we want to sing the praises of Athenian direct democracy. We come then to the Greco-Persian Wars, a main subject in Herodotus's The Historia. And we need to think, how is it, as already mentioned, that the Greeks are able to defeat this far stronger empire, the Persians? The first one is a bit feel-goody, but I think is true nonetheless. The Athenian army was good because they were citizen soldiers. They were on the defensive. They are the ones pushing back against a sort of, pre-modern imperialism. They're the ones defending against the conqueror, so they've got more to fight for. We can start from that level there. Who were these soldiers? They were called hoplites, and they could defeat the Persians because they didn't just have that extra incentive of, if we don't win, you will rule us. They also had better shields, better armor, better battle formations. In almost every capacity, they were outperforming the Persians. They operated in what are called phalanxes, and many of you may have seen this before, but if you haven't, it's sort of a front line of these hoplite soldiers. They go back 8 men, and you can almost imagine, if you've ever seen a shark's jaw, the way the teeth work. What happens is you, the attacker, you go to try to fight this phalanx of men. And what you find is, as you knock one down, as you kill one person, there's another soldier ready to move in. Much as a shark loses its teeth, there's another tooth immediately ready to pop up. That's how this is working. So they find this an incredibly difficult formation, the Persians. They find it an incredibly difficult battle formation to defeat because it's just wave after wave of person and you can't gain any ground. The first important victory for the Greeks is in 490 BCE at the Battle of Marathon. Darius, who I hope you remember, it hasn't been that long since I said his name, attacked Athens for supporting Greek resistance within his territory. Greek resistance within places like Halicarnassus, where Herodotus is from. In this battle, we saw 12,000 Athenians pitted against 25,000 Persian soldiers, and Athenians attacked while Persians were, according to stories, out gathering for food. They took on the element of surprise, and at least according to Herodotus, this played into their victory. The numbers that Herodotus gives us are astounding. He claims that on the Athenian side, there were 192 losses, and on the Persian side, 6,400 losses. Xerxes eventually returns to avenge his father's defeat, and when he returns with a huge army. But by this point, it's not just Athens, which I will remind you again, not Sparta, is the military and cultural capital of Greece. Athens, however, is teamed up by this point with Sparta. They're united in their struggle against Persia for control of a mountain pass north of Athens called Thermopylae. Greeks eventually lost, and Athens was sacked by these Persian forces. The tide turned, however, after Athenian naval commanders scored a major victory at a place called Salamis. Herodotus, in his history, emphasized the role of Artemisia, a woman ruler from Halicarnassus. Now, she became queen after her husband's death of this little Greek area where Herodotus is from that is nonetheless part of the Persian Empire. And because she's a Greek queen under Persian control, she's actually fighting not for the Greeks, but for the Persians. Out of a total force of 1,207 of what are called trimes, a 3-story boat powered by rowers on each level, Artemisia commanded 5. That's not insubstantial, and Herodotus is very clear about her sort of military prowess, despite eventually in these wars winding up on the losing side. Greek victory only set, however, the western border of the Persian Empire. It's important, although the Greco-Persian Wars loom large in ancient Western history, it's important to remember that Greece is just one small blip on a border for Persia. Their empire is huge, and they have other concerns. That means points to the Greeks. No Persian ruler is ever able to defeat them and rule what we think of now as Greece, but points to the Persians because they didn't lose anything from their empire either. They just established a firm border with a different force. Greek victory to defend themselves against the Persians marks about a century of intense cultural growth. This century after the Greco-Persian Wars is the century in which we get lots of genres of drama. We get tragedy, we get comedy after about 472 BCE. This is when the famous Greek author Aeschylus writes his play, The Persians. This is the earliest surviving Greek tragedy. Aeschylus, who was himself a veteran, has an interesting strategy in his writing style. He exaggerates Persian losses and the horrors of Persian defeat, the death and the violence and so forth, to make the audience sympathize with the Persians themselves, to reflect on the shared humanity of Persians and Greeks. It's a really interesting and nuanced look at war that we're getting coming out of this century after the Greco-Persian Wars. By the 5th century BCE, there were over 100 of these tragedies written by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, among others. Most of them about coming to terms with the concept of fate, coming to terms with fate in one's own life. In 478 BCE, just a few years before, we get the emergence of an attempt from Athens to politically unify parts of Greece. It does not work. the Athenians formed what they called the Delian League, a group of city-states made to drive out the Persians from Greek territory. After there was no threat, some league members said, well, okay, mission accomplished, we're done here, and they withdrew from the league. Athens wanted to keep this league together, and so it started invading those city-states that tried to withdraw. By 454 BCE, Athens had moved the treasury of the Delian League to Athens itself, establishing full control over other city-states who remained by force of violence or, just influence from Athens, part of the league. In 449 BCE, Pericles, who was a general and Athens' most popular leader, used the treasury to finance a building campaign in the city. He used the monies of the Delian League to build the Parthenon, a temple to Athena, and memorial to those who had died in those Persian wars. Sparta then emerges and rises and challenges Athens' desire to rule all of Greece. From 431 to 404, we get what are called the Peloponnesian Wars. Sparta got Persian aid to defeat Athens. Interesting, once was enemies, now Persia's happy for Sparta to throw Athens off. And a man named Thucydides writes a history of this war that is in a sort of new format for historical thinking in the human record because it focuses this history of the Peloponnesian Wars only on human actors. Sort of like Herodotus in the excerpt we read, no gods come into play. There is no supernatural element. It is just a political, military text. So Sparta and Athens are at war over the fate of the Delian League. Persia is funding Sparta, but even with all of this conflict going on within the Hellenistic, again, that means Greek, world, Athens is still home to some of the most famous philosophers in the Western tradition. We've got Socrates teaching Plato, teaching Aristotle. Like Confucius, Socrates, he has an interesting mode. He writes nothing down. His accounts, instead, come to us through his student, Plato. Socrates, in much of his teaching, stressed the virtue or excellence that humans could achieve by doing good in the world. Good actions, he said, came from developing wisdom. Socrates was put to death by Athenian rulers for supposedly not believing in the gods and for corrupting the youth of Athens. He famously drank a poison, hemlock, common method of execution of the day, and equally famously never apologized for anything that he had to say. Plato continued the Socratic tradition and the Socratic method of teaching by asking questions, eventually getting students to drill down to the core assumptions in their thought. Plato founded what was called the Academy, with a capital A, which taught students many things, but most importantly, it taught them ethics. Reason was the most powerful tool in deciding between right and wrong, and reason also determined that which was in your individual best interest, at least according to Plato. Plato's student, Aristotle, not a native of Athens, but instead a Macedonian, studied with Plato for over 20 years, then returned to Macedon to tutor no less than Alexander. Yeah, that Alexander the Great, after Plato died. He emphasized that being aware of starting points and moving logically from there was the source of a more reliable reason, a more reliable logic. He emphasized being able to explain yourself and all your assumptions as you begin thinking, and emphasized the observance of the natural world. It was Aristotle who figured out that the earth was round, something not all of us agree on or indeed know today. And he did this from observing the shadows the earth cast on the moon. He's also credited with figuring out that dolphins and whales were mammals, a scientific discovery that was lost for centuries. I have now mentioned Macedon, where Aristotle is from. What and where is it? Macedon is a region to the north of Greece. It is nonetheless mostly Greek. The people there would have spoke Greek, and while they had no cities and they had little farming, they managed to become powerful, or at least a ruler among them managed to become powerful, under King Philip II, whose reign dates are 359 to 336 BCE. And Philip II reorganized his army into a professional fighting force. Philip and his son Alexander built empires by taking wealth from the people they conquered. It's a pillage model, and it's one that is, in terms of conquering, very successful. So successful is this military under Philip II that when his son Alexander inherits the throne, he inherits an army that is more powerful than any local rivals. Alexander's army fought in tightly packed phalanx formations, those formations we've already discussed, with 17-foot-long pikes. He commanded an infantry of 15,000 and a cavalry of 1,800. Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE, and Alexander defeated Persia in 331 BCE. By 330 BCE, a satrap, one of those old tax collectors, you remember those folks, killed Darius III, and Alexander took over the Persian Empire all in one chunk, not piece by piece. He just took it all at one time. How is he going to rule? Alexander's been on the warpath with this 15,000 infantry, this 1,800 cavalry. He has an effective conquering force. He does not have an effective ruling force. He does not have that thing that builds stability, that ensures the surplus will be collected. He does not have that tax collecting, effective, reliable, stable bureaucracy. What is he going to do? He adopts what the Persians were doing. Effectively, Alexander rules by leaving the satrapies in place. Alexander's troops by this point had fought over 11,000 miles in what was an 8-year campaign. In Egypt, they fought in India, but they could not expand Persian territory. They inherited the borders of the Persian Empire, and that's all they could get. Alexander never fully figured out exactly how he should rule, as a conqueror or as a Persian emperor. That means that at Alexander's court, there was sort of a dichotomy. His military leaders would not bow to him the way Persian emperors demanded to be bowed to. He therefore made Persians behave in one way toward him as a Persian ruler, and Macedonians behave as they would to a Macedonian ruler. We've got sort of a two-tiered system here. Alexander also borrowed from Persian ruling practices by marrying a woman from a place that opposed his new imperial rule, Samarkand. So Persians had been using marriages as sort of uniting functions, uniting rulers from this place that doesn't like us to our capital, and Alexander takes over a similar practice. But the more Alexander adopts these Persian ruling practices, the more he alienates the Macedonian elites who put him in power. Even Alexander, who history and tradition tells us wept when there were no more worlds to conquer, is not, however, immortal. He dies in Babylon in 323 BCE. The effects of his 13-year reign as emperor were that thousands of soldiers stayed in places across Africa and Asia, marrying with local people and introducing Greek culture. This is traditionally understood as a process of what is called Hellenization. Multiple times I've reminded you that Hellas is Greece, so Hellenic culture is Greek culture. Hellenization is Greekification, if you prefer. And it's a process that's thought to have unfolded during Alexander's rule in many places that were, not yet that Greek. There are, I will just make you aware, scholars that argue against this as a one-way street. Alexander, for example, adopted more Persian culture in the way he ruled than he did impose Greek culture or Hellenistic culture on the court that he oversaw. The borders of Alexander's empire, along with the tax system, the way he ran the army, the administration, these were all very similar to the way Persians were doing business. This was not the Greeks imposing anything on the Persians. It was adoption of Persian practices. After Alexander's death, the empire breaks up. It breaks into 3 major sections. Each dynasty in each section continued then following Persian ruling practices, not Greek traditions, or at least not strictly Greek traditions without considerable Persian influence. After Alexander's death, His generals ruled the empire in 3 sections. We have Ptolemy in Egypt, and he's who's pictured in our slide, and I will ask you, R.E. Hellenization, exactly how Greek does that bust of Ptolemy look? The answer is not incredibly. We have Antigonus in Greece and Macedon, and we have Seleucus in Central and Western Asia. And you hopefully have heard the name Seleucus before, because it's Seleucus who sends Megasthenes as ambassador to the Mauryans, and so our world is becoming very close and connected. Seleucus ambassador being a major historical source on the Mauryan dynasty in ancient India. Alexander founded the city of Alexandria in 332 BCE in Egypt, and this became a major center of learning under Ptolemy. This is a place, this North African sort of Hellenistic Persian mix-up, mash-up zone becomes a place of enormous scientific importance. Euclid, for example, writes his text, The Elements, in Alexandria, and it is the first systematic explanation of the principles of geometry, and it doesn't stop there. In 240 BCE, Eratosthenes used Euclid's ideas to calculate the circumference of the Earth at 24,427 miles with an error of only 2%. The Greeks had known since Aristotle that the Earth was round, but thanks to these scientific developments going on in North Africa, in this weird hybrid place called Egypt that is North African, but also Persian, but also now ruled over by people from Greece and Macedonia, a really sort of bizarre hybrid international place, is also so intellectually, undeniably significant. It's fascinating. Fascinating though it may be, there's lots of fun facts we can think of. I hope that you bore people at dinner parties, reminding them that Athens, not Sparta, was the major military power in ancient Greece. It's interesting that the Phoenicians invent the writing system that the Greeks use with only the addition of vowels and things like that. But at a major world historical level, the takeaway here is the same takeaway I tried to establish in Unit 1, and that is, how do you run an empire? This matters. Empires are the main form of governance for most of the people who have lived in most of human history. And the answer to that varies. Not every empire is exactly the same. They're all going to have that key protection racket, because every state has that key protection racket. And some of them are going to lean more on religious elements of that protection racket, and some of them are going to lean more on agricultural production elements, some of them more on the violent elements. But they all have to do it, because they all have to survive and build wealth. And the way you build wealth is through tax. That's how you extract the surplus. That means whether your protection racket is primarily religious, military, infrastructural, whatever it is, it has to be stable, it has to be organized. It has to leave enough diversity that you don't have people erupting against you all the time. So at the bottom level of your empire, you need a lot of room for people to practice whatever religion was there before you, speak whatever language was there before you, have whatever laws were there before you. But at the top levels of your empire, you need some systematization. You need one language that all of your local elites speak so they can get orders. You need one tax collection system that is rational and makes sense and is regular and is ordered and is stable and is reliable. And you cannot live without a system of bureaucrats that is dependable at that elite level to operate that tax system for you. And Persia had it. People are killing each other left and right after Darius I in Persia, starting with Xerxes, and the system is so stable it can continue. The system is so stable that it survives Alexander conquering Persia. And he looks around and says, I don't have any better ideas than what you've already done. That's the significance of these surplus extraction schemes, these tax systems built on these bureaucracies with more or less religious inflection, that nonetheless, despite their homogeneity, allow local people to live as much of their life as they did before as is possible. And that's the whole point.